Raritan, New Jersey, 1936. Nobody in the small industrial town of Raritan would have believed that the young man stumbling out of Donovan's bar at 2 a.m. would become the most decorated Marine in American history. John Basilone was just another Italian-American kid from the wrong side of town, unemployed, directionless, and rapidly earning a reputation as the kind of troublemaker that respectable families warned their daughters about. The autumn rain fell in cold sheets across the cobblestone streets of Raritan, turning the industrial town into a gray blur of factory smoke and economic despair. John Basilone pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked unsteadily down Somerset Street, the taste of cheap whiskey burning in his throat and the weight of another wasted day pressing down on his conscience. But what they didn't know was that in exactly 6 years, this same man would single-handedly stop an entire Japanese regiment and change the course of World War I. 19 years old, John was already developing a reputation that worried his family and impressed the wrong kind of people. The Basilone family had immigrated from Italy in the early 1900s, like thousands of other families seeking better opportunities in America. His father, Salvatore, worked as a tailor. His mother, Teresa, took in washing and mending to help support the family of 10 children. They were hardworking, God-fearing people who believed that discipline, education, and honest labor were the keys to success in their adopted homeland. John was their 5th child, born on November 4, 1916, and from an early age, it was clear that he would test every assumption his parents held about raising children in America. While his siblings attended church regularly, studied hard in school, and learned trades that would provide steady employment, John seemed drawn to chaos like a moth to flame. The America of 1936 was a nation still clawing its way out of the Great Depression. In towns like Raritan, young men had few options: work in the factories if you could find a job, join one of the government work programs, or waste away on street corners talking about better times that might never come. For John Basilone, the limited opportunities of Depression-era America felt like a prison sentence. He was strong, intelligent, and possessed of a natural leadership ability that manifested itself in all the wrong ways. Instead of organizing study groups or sports teams, he organized street fights and petty schemes that kept the local police busy and his parents awake at night with worry. John Basilone had tried the factory route, but it felt like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. At 19, he was strong-backed and willing to work, but jobs were scarce and competition was fierce among the hundreds of unemployed men who gathered at factory gates every morning, hoping for a day's work. He'd been laid off from 3 different positions in 2 years, first from Michael's textile mill when orders dried up, then from a construction crew when the public works project ran out of federal funding, and finally from a job loading trucks at the railway depot when the supervisor decided he didn't like John's attitude toward authority. "Johnny's a good kid," his father Salvatore would tell the neighbors who inquired about his son's latest troubles, his heavily accented English carrying the weight of old-world disappointment. "But he's got no direction, no discipline. He needs something to focus that energy before it destroys him." Salvatore Basilone understood his son better than most people realized. He had come to America with nothing but determination and the skills he had learned as a tailor in the old country. Through 16-hour workdays and careful saving, he had built a small but respectable business and raised 9 children who were gradually finding their places in American society. But John was different. John had an intensity, a restless energy that couldn't be satisfied by the quiet respectability that had defined the Basilone family's American dream. That energy was becoming a problem. John had been in 4 fights in the past month, including one outside Murphy's Tavern that left another man hospitalized with a broken jaw and 2 missing teeth. The local police knew him by name, and not in a good way. Officer Patrick O'Malley, who had grown up in Raritan and remembered when John was just another kid playing stickball in the street, had pulled him aside after the last incident. "Johnny," O'Malley had said, his Irish accent softened by 30 years in New Jersey, "you're walking a dangerous path here. Keep this up, and you're going to find yourself in state prison before you're 21. Is that what you want? Is that what your parents deserve?" The conversation had shaken John more than he cared to admit. He respected Officer O'Malley, who had always treated him fairly despite his growing reputation. But respect wasn't enough to quiet the restlessness that seemed to burn in his chest like acid. It was on a cold February morning in 1937, nursing a hangover that felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to his skull and facing the prospect of another day without work or purpose, that John Basilone walked into the Army recruiting station in New Brunswick. The decision wasn't planned or carefully considered. It was the desperate act of a young man who had run out of options and was smart enough to recognize that he needed to change his life before his life destroyed him. The recruiting station was located in a narrow storefront between a pawn shop and a delicatessen, its windows plastered with posters showing clean-cut soldiers in crisp uniforms standing proudly beneath American flags. "Serve your country," the posters proclaimed. "See the world. Learn a trade." Staff Sergeant William Murphy was a career soldier with 20 years of service and the weathered face of a man who had seen enough of the world to appreciate the stability of a regular paycheck. He looked up from his paperwork as John entered, taking in the young man's slightly disheveled appearance and the smell of alcohol that still clung to his clothes. "Can I help you, son?" "I want to join the Army," John said, his voice carrying more certainty than he actually felt. Sergeant Murphy studied him for a moment. "You sure about that? The Army isn't a place to hide from your problems. It's a place where you learn to face them." "I'm not hiding from anything," John replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I just need something different than what I've got here." The recruiting process took most of the morning. Physical examination, written tests, background checks, interviews designed to weed out the troublemakers and misfits who saw military service as an easy escape from civilian responsibilities. John passed everything, though Sergeant Murphy made it clear that his recent legal troubles had been noted and would be watched carefully. "The Army will give you structure, discipline, and purpose," Murphy explained as John signed the enlistment papers. "But it won't make you into something you're not. You'll still be John Basilone when you put on that uniform. The question is, what kind of John Basilone do you want to be?" But first, he would have to survive 3 years that nearly broke his spirit and taught him everything about warfare except how to kill. Philippines, 1937 to 1940. The troop transport ship USS Republic that carried Private John Basilone across the Pacific was a floating prison of seasick soldiers, brutal discipline, and the gradual realization that military service was nothing like the recruiting posters had promised. For a young man who had never been more than 50 miles from Raritan, the 3-week journey to the Philippines was like traveling to another planet. The ship was overcrowded, understaffed, and poorly ventilated. Below decks, where the enlisted men were housed, the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and the disinfectant that the Navy used to keep disease from spreading through the cramped quarters. John's bunk was a canvas cot suspended from the bulkhead by chains, positioned so close to his neighbors that turning over required careful coordination. During the first week of the voyage, John was so seasick that he could barely keep water down, let alone the Army's standard rations of canned beef and hardtack biscuits. He spent most of his time hanging over the rail, vomiting into the Pacific while older soldiers laughed at his misery and offered unhelpful advice about sea legs and ginger root. "First time on a ship, farm boy?" asked Corporal Eddie Santos, a career soldier from Chicago who was returning to the Philippines for his 3rd tour. Santos was small and wiry, with the kind of street-smart toughness that John recognized from his own neighborhood, but refined by years of military discipline. "Yeah," John managed to say between waves of nausea. "How long does this last?" "Depends on the men," Santos replied, lighting a cigarette despite the no-smoking regulations. "Some guys never get their sea legs. They spend the whole trip puking their guts out and arrive in Manila looking like scarecrows. Others adapt in a few days and start enjoying the voyage." "Which kind are you betting I am?" John asked. Santos studied him appraisingly. "I think you're the kind who adapts. You've got that look, like you've been through some hard times but you're still standing. That's what it takes to survive in the Philippines." Santos was right about John's adaptability, but wrong about how easy survival would be. Fort Stotsenburg, located 40 miles north of Manila in the jungle highlands of central Luzon, was where the U.S. Army trained soldiers for tropical warfare. It was also where John Basilone first learned that there was a vast difference between being tough on the streets of New Jersey and being a soldier in the regular army. The fort itself was a collection of wooden barracks, parade grounds, and training facilities carved out of dense tropical jungle. The climate was relentlessly hot and humid, with daily temperatures that rarely dropped below 85 degrees and humidity that made every uniform feel like it was soaked in sweat. The jungle pressed in on all sides, filled with insects, snakes, and tropical diseases that could kill a man as efficiently as any enemy bullet, but it was the military discipline that proved to be John's greatest challenge. Basilone. Sergeant First Class Robert McKinney's voice cut across the parade ground like a whip crack. McKinney was a 20-year veteran who had served in France during the Great War, and he had no patience for recruits who thought military service was going to be an adventure. "What the hell do you call that formation? My grandmother could stand straighter than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. McKinney was built like a bull, with massive shoulders and arms that looked capable of breaking a man in half. His face was scarred from shrapnel wounds suffered at Below Wood, and his eyes held the kind of hardness that came from watching too many young soldiers die because they hadn't learned their lessons well enough. The first 6 months were hell for John Basilone. He was used to fighting his own battles, making his own decisions, answering to no one but himself and occasionally his parents. The army demanded absolute obedience, instant compliance with orders regardless of how arbitrary they seemed, and the complete subordination of individual will to unit discipline. Every morning began at 5 a.m. with reveille, followed by calisthenics, uniform inspection, and close order drill that seemed designed to break the spirit rather than build military skills. The days were filled with weapons training, map reading, first aid instruction, and endless repetitions of basic military procedures until they became automatic responses. For a young man who had never successfully held a civilian job for more than 6 months, the regimentation was suffocating. John chafed under the constant supervision, the mindless repetition of military courtesies, and the way that even the smallest infraction could result in punishment details that lasted for hours. He nearly deserted twice during those first months. The first time, he made it all the way to Manila before military police found him drinking in a waterfront bar called the Anchor, trying to negotiate passage on a merchant ship back to the States. He had managed to convince himself that military service was a mistake, that he wasn't cut out for taking orders from men who seemed to enjoy making his life miserable. "You John Basilone?" asked the MP sergeant who found him. Sergeant Frank Williams was a big man with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with soldiers who had made bad decisions. "Maybe," John replied, though his heart was already sinking. He had been AWOL for 3 days, and he knew that meant serious trouble. "Maybe isn't going to cut it, son. You're coming with us." The ride back to Fort Stotzenberg was conducted in silence, John sitting in the back of an army truck with his hands cuffed behind his back, watching the Philippine countryside roll past and wondering if he had just destroyed any chance of making something of his life. The stockade at Fort Stotzenberg was a collection of concrete cells that had been built during the Spanish-American War and hadn't been improved much since then. John spent 2 weeks there, subsisting on bread and water, sleeping on a concrete floor, and thinking about the choices that had brought him to this point. His second attempt at desertion came 3 months later and was even less successful than the first. This time, he was caught at the main gate of the fort, trying to ride a stolen bicycle to the coast. The plan had been to reach the fishing village of Lingayen and somehow by passage on a boat to Hong Kong, where he imagined he could disappear into the international community of expatriates and drifters. Both times, he was sent to the stockade. Both times, he came out more bitter and rebellious than before, convinced that the army was determined to break him for no reason other than institutional sadism. It was during his second stint in the stockade that John encountered Captain James Morrison, the company command, Philippines, 1937 to 1940. The troop transport ship USS Republic that carried Private John Basilone across the Pacific was a floating prison of seasick soldiers, brutal discipline, and the gradual realization that military service was nothing like the recruiting posters had promised. For a young man who had never been more than 50 miles from Raritan, the 3-week journey to the Philippines was like traveling to another planet. The ship was overcrowded, understaffed, and poorly ventilated. Below decks, where the enlisted men were housed, The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, seasickness, and the disinfectant that the Navy used to keep disease from spreading through the cramped quarters. John's bunk was a canvas cot suspended from the bulkhead by chains, positioned so close to his neighbors that turning over required careful coordination. During the first week of the voyage, John was so seasick that he could barely keep water down, let alone the Army's standard rations of canned beef and hardtack biscuits. He spent most of his time hanging over the rail, vomiting into the Pacific while older soldiers laughed at his misery and offered unhelpful advice about sea legs and ginger root. First time on a ship, farm boy, asked Corporal Eddie Santos, a career soldier from Chicago who was returning to the Philippines for his third tour. Santos was small and wiry, with the kind of street-smart toughness that John recognized from his own neighborhood, but refined by years of military discipline. "Yeah," John managed to say between waves of nausea. "How long does this last?" "Depends on the men," Santos replied, lighting a cigarette despite. Captain Morrison walked over to his window, looking out at the jungle that surrounded Fort Stotzenberg. In the distance, they could see the volcanic peaks of the Zambales Mountains, shrouded in clouds that promised another afternoon of tropical rain. "I grew up poor too, son," Morrison continued. "Dirt poor in Oklahoma during the worst years of the Depression. My father was a sharecropper who could barely feed his family, let alone send his children to school. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is against you, like every authority figure is just another person trying to keep you down." He turned back to face John, his expression serious but not unkind. "But sometimes the thing you're fighting against is actually trying to save your life. The Japanese are building up their military forces all over the Pacific. War is coming, Basilone, whether we want it or not. When it does, you're going to need every skill we're trying to teach you. More than that, other soldiers are going to depend on you to know your job well enough to keep them alive." That conversation planted a seed that would gradually transform John Basilone's approach to military service. Not immediately, he was too proud and too angry to admit that he might have been wrong about the Army. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to see military discipline not as an attack on his independence but as a tool that could make him stronger and more capable than he had ever imagined possible. The change became most apparent when he was assigned to a machine gun crew during advanced infantry training. The Browning .30 caliber machine gun was a weapon that demanded both technical precision and tactical understanding. Weighing over 30 pounds and capable of firing 450 rounds per minute, it could cut down dozens of men in seconds when properly employed. But it was also temperamental, prone to jamming under adverse conditions, and required absolute precision in maintenance and operation to function effectively in combat. "This weapon will keep you alive," explained Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Kelly during the first day of machine gun training. Kelly was a veteran of the Marine Corps who had transferred to the Army and brought with him a reputation for producing the most competent machine gunners in the Pacific Theater. He was a compact, muscular man with graying hair and hands that bore the scars of years spent working with military equipment under difficult conditions. "But," Kelly continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen combat and understood the life and death importance of proper training, "it will only keep you alive if you know it better than you know your own name. Every part, every function, every possible malfunction. Your life and the lives of every soldier in your unit will depend on your ability to keep this gun firing when everyone else is dead or running." John Basilone took those words to heart with an intensity that surprised even himself. For the first time since enlisting, he had found something in military service that engaged his natural mechanical aptitude and leadership instincts. He spent hours learning to disassemble and reassemble the machine gun blindfolded, timing himself until he could complete the process in under 2 minutes. He memorized the technical manual until he could recite maintenance procedures from memory, understanding not just what to do but why each step was necessary. But it was during live-fire exercises that John really began to understand the tactical complexities of machine gun warfare. The weapon wasn't just about pointing and shooting, it required an understanding of fields of fire, interlocking coverage patterns, ammunition conservation, and the coordination of fire with other weapons systems. A good machine gunner had to think like a chess player, anticipating enemy movements and positioning his weapon to achieve maximum effectiveness. Basilone's got a real feel for this, Sergeant Kelly observed during a training exercise that simulated a defensive action against attacking infantry. John had positioned his machine gun to cover a natural avenue of approach, coordinated his fire with riflemen on both flanks, and demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking that usually took months to develop. "He sees the whole battlefield, not just his little piece of it," agreed Corporal Santos, who had been assigned as John's assistant gunner. "Most guys get tunnel vision when they're behind the gun. They focus on what's right in front of them and lose track of the bigger picture. But Basilone's always thinking about how his fire affects the entire defensive position." More importantly, other soldiers began to look to John for leadership. His natural charisma, combined with his growing technical expertise and tactical understanding, made him someone that other soldiers trusted and wanted to follow. He became the informal leader of his training class, the person that other machine gunners came to when they had questions about weapons maintenance or tactical employment. The transformation wasn't complete. John still struggled with some aspects of military discipline and occasionally clashed with officers who relied too heavily on rank rather than competence. But he had found his place in the army, and more importantly, he had discovered that military service could be a vehicle for personal growth rather than just a prison sentence served in uniform. But what John Basilone learned in the Philippines was nothing compared to what was waiting for him in the jungles of the Solomon Islands. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. John Basilone was sitting at a wooden table in the mess hall at Fort Stotzenburg, methodically working his way through a breakfast of powdered eggs and canned bacon, when the radio in the corner of the room crackled to life with an emergency bulletin that would change his life forever. The mess hall was nearly empty that Sunday morning. Most of the soldiers were either sleeping off Saturday night's liberty in Manila or attending church services in the base chapel. John preferred the quiet of early morning, when he could eat in peace and review the technical manuals that had become his constant companions. He had been promoted to staff sergeant 6 months earlier and was now responsible for training new machine gunners who arrived on every transport ship from the States. The radio, usually tuned to music or entertainment programs from San Francisco, suddenly fell silent except for the static that indicated an emergency broadcast was being transmitted across the Pacific. Then a voice, tight with tension and disbelief, began speaking words that would echo in American memory forever. "We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air. President Roosevelt has just announced." The attack began at 7:55 this morning, Hawaiian time. John's fork stopped halfway to his mouth as the implications of what he was hearing sank in. Around him, the few other soldiers in the mess hall had frozen in place, their conversations dying as they focused on the radio with expressions of shock and growing anger. Casualties are reported as very heavy. The battleship Arizona has been destroyed. The Oklahoma has capsized. At least 6 other battleships have been damaged or sunk. Hundreds of American servicemen are reported dead or missing. "Son of a bitch," whispered Corporal Martinez, a machine gunner from John's training section. "They actually did it. The bastards actually attacked us." John felt something cold settle in his stomach, not fear exactly, but the recognition that everything had changed in the space of a few minutes. Like every American serviceman in the Pacific, he had been aware of the growing tension with Japan. Intelligence reports had been flowing through military channels for months, describing Japanese military buildups, aggressive moves in China and Southeast Asia, and increasingly hostile diplomatic communications. Within an hour of the radio broadcast, Fort Stotzenburg was transformed from a sleepy training base into a combat outpost. Sirens wailed across the compound as soldiers ran to their duty stations. Officers who had been sleeping or attending church services appeared in hastily donned uniforms, their faces grim with the knowledge that American forces in the Philippines were now isolated and vulnerable. "All personnel report to your unit commanders immediately," announced the base public address system. "This is not a drill. All leaves and passes are cancelled. All personnel report to your unit commanders immediately." John hurried to the company area, where Captain Morrison was already briefing the senior non-commissioned officers on the situation. The captain's usual calm demeanor had been replaced by the focused intensity of a professional soldier who understood that he was about to face his first real test of command. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying across the assembled NCOs, "as you all know by now, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. We don't yet have complete information about the extent of the damage, but it's clear that the Pacific Fleet has suffered heavy casualties." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in before continuing. "This means that American forces in the Philippines are now cut off from reinforcement or resupply from the mainland. We are on our own until the Navy can fight its way back across the Pacific." The room was absolutely quiet as the implications of their situation became clear. The Philippines were over 5,000 miles from the nearest major American naval base. Without the Pacific Fleet to protect supply convoys and provide naval gunfire support, the 30,000 American soldiers stationed in the islands would have to defend themselves against whatever forces Japan decided to commit to the invasion of the Philippines. 3 days later, as American forces prepared for the inevitable Japanese invasion of the Philippines, John received orders that would transform his military career and ultimately lead him to immortality. Basilone. Captain Morrison called him into his office on the afternoon of December 10th. "I have new orders for you." John reported as ordered, expecting to receive instructions for defensive preparations or additional training responsibilities. Instead, he found Captain Morrison holding a set of transfer orders that would take him away from the only military unit he had ever known. "You're being transferred to the Marine Corps," Morrison announced. "The 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, to be specific. They need experienced machine gunners, and you're the best we have." John was stunned. The Marine Corps had a reputation as an elite force that recruited only the best soldiers and trained them to standards that exceeded even the regular army. Being selected for transfer to the Marines was both an honor and a recognition of professional competence. "Sir, may I ask why the Marines want Army machine gunners?" John asked. Morrison walked over to his map of the Pacific, which was now covered with red pins indicating Japanese military positions and probable invasion routes. "Because they're going to be doing the hardest fighting in this war, and they need NCOs who can train Marines to survive what's coming." He turned back to face John, his expression serious but not unkind. "The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was just the beginning, Sergeant. They're going to try to conquer the entire Pacific, island by island, until they have enough territory and resources to force us to negotiate a peace on their terms." Morrison paused, considering his next words carefully. "But we're not going to let that happen. We're going to fight our way back across the Pacific, and we're going to win. But it's going to require amphibious assaults against fortified positions, landing operations under fire, and the kind of close-quarters combat that requires the highest level of training and leadership. The Marines," he continued, "are going to be the spearhead of that offensive. They need soldiers like you, experienced, competent, and capable of leading men in combat. This is your chance to be part of something bigger than anything you've ever imagined." As John packed his few personal belongings and prepared to leave Fort Stotzenburg, he reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. 3 years earlier, he had been a troublemaker from Raritan, New Jersey, with no prospects and no purpose. Now he was a staff sergeant in the United States Army, respected by his soldiers and selected for transfer to an elite fighting force, but he had no idea that within less than a year, he would be participating in the first major Allied offensive against the Japanese Empire, fighting on an island called Guadalcanal that would test every skill he had learned during his time in the Philippines. And he had no idea that his actions on that distant island would make him the most famous Marine in America and change his life in ways that he could never have anticipated. The transformation from troublemaker to hero was about to be tested in the crucible of the Pacific War. Melbourne, Australia, July 1942. The 1st Marine Division was a collection of misfits, volunteers, and professionals preparing for something that had never been attempted in modern warfare: a full-scale amphibious assault against a heavily fortified enemy position. The Marines had gathered in Australia like a storm building over the Pacific, drawing strength from the urgency of their mission and the knowledge that failure would mean the loss of the entire South Pacific to Japanese expansion. Staff Sergeant John Basilone, he had been promoted twice since transferring to the Marines and adapting to their more demanding standards, was now a squad leader in Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. His reputation as a machine gunner had preceded him from the Philippines, and he found himself training Marines who were barely out of high school, young men who had enlisted in the wave of patriotic fervor that followed Pearl Harbor. The training camp outside Melbourne was a sprawling collection of tents, temporary buildings, and improvised facilities that housed nearly 20,000 Marines preparing for their first combat operation. The Australian winter provided a stark contrast to the tropical conditions they would soon face in the Solomon Islands, but it gave them time to train without the distractions of extreme heat and humidity. "Listen up, you boot Marines," Basilone addressed his squad during a weapons training session conducted on a firing range carved out of the Australian countryside. "That machine gun isn't a toy, and it isn't a magic wand that's going to win battles by itself. It's a precision instrument that can save your life and the lives of every Marine in your unit. But only if you treat it with the respect it deserves and understand how to employ it tactically." The Marines in his squad were a typical cross-section of American youth circa 1942. There was Private Robert Powell from Iowa, 18 years old and fresh from boot camp at Parris Island, who still had the soft features and wide-eyed expression of someone who had never been far from his family's farm. Corporal Michael Antonelli from Brooklyn brought street smarts and mechanical aptitude, but also the kind of aggressive attitude that could be either an asset or a liability in combat. Private Jimmy Rodriguez from Texas was quiet and methodical, the kind of soldier who absorbed training without complaint and could be counted on to follow orders even under the most difficult circumstances. Staff Sergeant Powell asked during a break in the training, "What's it really like in combat? I mean, what should we expect when we finally face the Japanese?" It was a question that every young Marine asked, and one that experienced NCOs struggled to answer honestly without terrifying the men they were supposed to lead. John had been thinking about combat ever since his transfer to the Marines, trying to imagine what it would be like to face an enemy that preferred death to surrender and had demonstrated a willingness to fight with fanatical determination. "Combat is chaos," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying warfare even if he had never experienced it directly. "Everything you think you know, every plan you've made, every assumption you've held about how you'll react under fire, all of that goes out the window in the first 10 seconds of contact with the enemy." He paused, studying the earnest young faces that were hanging on his every word. These Marines were about to face something that most of them couldn't even imagine: close-quarters combat against an enemy that had been indoctrinated to believe that death in battle was preferable to the shame of defeat. "Your training takes over," he continued, "but only if you've trained hard enough and often enough that your responses become automatic. The Marines next to you become more important than your own family, because they're the only people in the world who can help you survive the next few minutes. And the only thing that really matters is completing the mission and bringing everyone home alive." John gestured toward the machine gun that was the centerpiece of their training. "This weapon can fire 450 rounds per minute, which means it can kill a lot of enemy soldiers very quickly. But it can also jam at the worst possible moment, overheat when you need it most, or malfunction because you didn't maintain it properly. Your job is to know this weapon so well that you can operate it in the dark, in the rain, under enemy fire, when you're scared out of your mind and half-deaf from artillery explosions. But here's the most important thing," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone: "Fear will try to control you. It will tell you to run, to hide, to freeze up when your Marines need you most. Everyone gets scared in combat. Anyone who tells you different is either lying or crazy. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is doing your job despite being scared out of your mind." What John Basilone didn't tell these young Marines was that he was just as apprehensive as they were. The difference was that he had learned to channel that apprehension into focused preparation, using his nervous energy to drive himself to even higher standards of training and readiness. The intelligence briefings they received painted a picture of an enemy that was both highly capable and completely ruthless. Japanese soldiers were described as well-trained, disciplined, and motivated by a warrior culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. They had proven their effectiveness in China, Southeast Asia, and during the early months of the Pacific War, when they had conquered territory with a speed and efficiency that had shocked American military planners. "The Japanese soldier is not 10 feet tall," explained Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller during one of the briefings attended by senior NCOs. Puller was already a legend in the Marine Corps, a Mustang officer who had risen from enlisted ranks and earned a reputation as one of the most effective combat leaders in the service. His presence in the 1st Marine Division was both reassuring and ominous. The Corps didn't assign their best officers to easy missions. "But don't make the mistake of underestimating him either," Puller continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had studied the enemy extensively. "He's been fighting for years in China, where he's learned to operate with minimal supplies and maximum aggression. He's been indoctrinated to believe that death in battle brings honor to himself and his family. And he's had months to prepare defensive positions on whatever island we're going to assault." The identity of their target was still classified, known only to the senior officers who attended the most sensitive planning sessions. But rumors spread through the division like wildfire. They were going to invade Japan itself, or perhaps capture the major Japanese naval base at Rabaul, or possibly assault the fortress island of Truk. What none of them guessed was that their target was a small, obscure island in the Solomon chain that most Americans had never heard of, Guadalcanal. The final weeks of training were intensive and focused, designed to prepare the Marines for the specific challenges of amphibious warfare. They practiced beach landings, using landing craft to assault fortified positions while under simulated enemy fire. They learned to coordinate infantry attacks with naval gunfire support, timing their movements to take advantage of the devastating firepower that American ships could bring to bear on enemy positions. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to function as a unit, developing the kind of trust and mutual dependence that would be essential for survival in combat. John watched his Marines transform from a collection of individual soldiers into a cohesive fighting unit, each man understanding his role and his responsibility to the others. On August 1, 1942, the 1st Marine Division boarded transport ships and sailed north from Australia toward their still-secret destination. As the Australian coast disappeared behind them and they entered the vast blue emptiness of the Coral Sea, John Basilone felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension that he had never experienced before. He was about to face the test that every professional soldier both dreads and desires, the moment when training becomes reality and theory becomes survival. In 6 days, he would either prove himself in combat or die trying, but he had no way of knowing that his actions during the next few months would establish him as one of the greatest heroes in Marine Corps history, or that surviving the battle would create challenges that were almost as difficult as the fighting itself. But what awaited them on that tropical island would test every lesson John Basilone had learned about warfare, leadership, and survival. Guadalcanal, August 7, 1942. The landing at Red Beach was almost anticlimactic. After months of training for a bloody amphibious assault, the Marines found the beaches largely undefended. The Japanese had withdrawn into the jungle, leaving behind half-completed runways and abandoned equipment. "This is too easy," Basilone muttered to his squad as they moved inland from the beach. "Something's not right." He was correct to be suspicious. The Japanese hadn't abandoned Guadalcanal. They had simply chosen to defend it from positions that would give them maximum advantage. For the next 6 months, the Marines would face an enemy that attacked at night, used the jungle as cover, and was willing to sacrifice thousands of lives to drive the Americans back into the sea. The first major test came on August 21, when Japanese forces launched a coordinated attack against the Marine perimeter around Henderson Field, the crucial airstrip that would determine control of the southern Solomon Islands. Basilone's machine gun section was positioned along the Ilu River, covering a sector of the perimeter that intelligence reports suggested was a likely avenue of Japanese attack. For 3 days, they had heard the sounds of enemy forces moving through the jungle, voices calling out in Japanese, the clatter of equipment being moved into position, the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. "They're out there," Corporal Michael Antonelli whispered to Basilone as they crouched in their fighting position. "I can smell them." "Stay alert," Basilone replied. "When they come, it's going to be fast and it's going to be ugly." The attack came at dawn on August 21st. Over 900 Japanese soldiers, led by Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, charged across the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River in a desperate attempt to overrun the Marine positions and recapture Henderson Field. It was John Basilone's first real taste of combat, and it would establish his reputation as one of the deadliest machine gunners in the Pacific. "Here they come," Antonelli shouted as hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle, screaming battle cries and firing as they ran toward the Marine positions. Basilone opened fire with his Browning .30 caliber machine gun, sending streams of bullets into the attacking force. The weapon chattered steadily, cutting down the first wave of attackers and forcing the survivors to take cover behind fallen logs and debris, but the Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave of soldiers charged across the sandbar, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, determined to break through the Marine lines or die trying. For 4 hours, Basilone's machine gun was the anchor of the Marine defense. When his weapon overheated, he had his assistant gunner pour water over the barrel to cool it down. When they ran low on ammunition, he sent Marines crawling back to supply points under enemy fire to bring up more belts of .30 caliber rounds, and when Japanese soldiers finally broke through a section of the Marine line and threatened to overrun his position, Basilone grabbed his .45 caliber pistol and fought them hand-to-hand in the muddy crater that had become his fighting position. When the sun set on August 21st, the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River was carpeted with Japanese dead. Over 800 of Colonel Ichiki's 900 men had been killed, and the Marine perimeter remained intact. John Basilone had fired over 2,000 rounds through his machine gun and personally accounted for dozens of enemy casualties. More importantly, his leadership had kept his section of the line from breaking when the Japanese attack was at its most intense, but this was just the beginning. The real test was still coming. What happened 2 months later would transform John Basilone from a competent squad leader into a legend. Henderson Field Perimeter, October 24, 1942. Late October, Guadalcanal had become a nightmare landscape of mud, disease, constant combat, and the psychological strain that comes from knowing that death might arrive at any moment from any direction. The Marines had been fighting for over 2 months with inadequate supplies, sporadic reinforcements, and the knowledge that they were completely cut off from significant American support. John Basilone, now promoted to platoon sergeant after his original platoon leader had been evacuated with severe dysentery, commanded 2 machine gun sections covering a crucial 200-yard sector of the Henderson Field perimeter. The airfield itself had become both the strategic prize and the focal point of Japanese attacks. Whoever controlled Henderson Field would control the sea lanes around Guadalcanal. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were massing for their most ambitious attack yet, a coordinated assault involving over 3,000 soldiers from the elite Sendai Division, supported by artillery that had been secretly moved into position and coordinated with naval bombardment from Japanese warships. "This is it, boys," Basilone told his machine gunners as they prepared their positions. The jungle pressed in on all sides, dense and impenetrable, filled with the sounds of insects, birds, and the occasional crack of a Japanese sniper's rifle. "Intelligence says they're going to throw everything they have at us. If we hold, we win. If we break," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Every Marine on Guadalcanal understood the consequences of failure. The Japanese attack began at exactly 9 p.m. on October 24 with an artillery barrage that was unlike anything the Marines had experienced during their time on Guadalcanal. Instead of the sporadic, harassing fire that had become routine, this was a concentrated, devastating bombardment that lasted for over an hour. Shells screamed overhead in continuous succession, exploding in the Marine positions and sending fountains of mud, shrapnel, and pulverized coral in all directions. The noise was deafening, a continuous thunder that made communication impossible and left Marines crouched in their foxholes, covering their ears and praying that the next shell wouldn't land directly on their position. John huddled in his command position, a reinforced foxhole located behind his 2 machine gun teams, using a field telephone to try to maintain contact with his company commander and coordinate defensive fires. But the telephone lines had been cut by artillery fire, and the radio was producing nothing but static punctuated by desperate calls for help from other sectors of the perimeter. "Sergeant Basilone." Corporal Antonelli crawled through the mud toward John's position, his uniform torn and bloody from flying shrapnel. Number 2 gun is out of action. Direct hit from a mortar round. Martinez is dead, Williams is wounded bad. The loss of a machine gun was catastrophic for defensive operations. Each weapon was positioned to cover specific fields of fire, and the loss of even one gun could create gaps in the defensive coverage that attacking infantry could exploit. "Get Williams back to the aid station," John shouted over the continuing artillery fire. Then help Johnson move his gun to cover Martinez's sector. But even as he gave the order, John could see Japanese signal flares rising from the jungle beyond the perimeter, green, red, and white lights that indicated the infantry attack was about to begin. At 11:15 p.m., the real battle began. The first Japanese soldiers to emerge from the jungle were not the screaming, suicidal attackers that American propaganda had portrayed. These were professional soldiers from an elite unit, advancing in coordinated formations and using cover and concealment with the skill of men who had been fighting for years in China and Southeast Asia. John's machine gun opened fire as soon as the first Japanese soldiers came within effective range, sending streams of .30 caliber bullets into the attacking formation. The weapon chattered steadily, its muzzle flash creating a strobing light that illuminated the battlefield in split-second glimpses of chaos and violence. The Japanese attack was unlike anything the Marines had faced before. Instead of the wild, undisciplined banzai charges that had characterized earlier encounters, this was a methodical, professional assault by soldiers who understood small unit tactics and knew how to coordinate their movements with supporting fires from mortars and machine guns. "They're not charging," shouted Private Johnson, the assistant gunner who was feeding ammunition belts into the machine gun. "They're actually using tactics." John could see what Johnson meant. The Japanese were advancing by bounds, with some soldiers providing covering fire while others moved forward to better positions. When they encountered strong resistance, they would coordinate mortar fire to suppress the American positions, then resume their advance when the defensive fires slackened. But John had been studying machine gun tactics for years, and he understood that successful defensive action required more than just pointing the weapon at the enemy and pulling the trigger. He began to fire in short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining maximum effectiveness. He coordinated his fires with the rifle squads on his flanks, ensuring that the Japanese couldn't exploit gaps between different weapons systems. Most importantly, he moved the machine gun periodically to prevent the enemy from pinpointing its location and bringing concentrated fire to bear on his position. For the first hour of the battle, this tactical approach was successful. The Japanese attack was contained, with heavy enemy casualties and minimal losses among the defending Marines. But as the night wore on and the attacks intensified, John began to realize that this battle would test every skill he had learned during his years of military service. At 12:30 a.m., Japanese artillery began falling on the Marine positions with pinpoint accuracy, indicating that enemy observers had identified key defensive positions and were directing fires with deadly precision. John's machine gun position took a near-direct hit from a mortar round, stunning both gunners and damaging the tripod that held the weapon steady. "I can't see," Johnson shouted, his hands covering his eyes as blood streamed down his face from shrapnel wounds. "I can't see anything." Without hesitation, John took over as gunner, checking the machine gun for damage and finding that while the tripod was bent, the weapon itself was still functional. He resumed firing, using the damaged tripod as best he could while Private Rodriguez, the ammunition bearer, took over Johnson's duties feeding belts into the gun. But the damaged tripod made accurate fire almost impossible, and John could see Japanese soldiers beginning to infiltrate closer to his position. If they succeeded in getting within grenade range, his entire section would be overrun. That's when Staff Sergeant John Basilone made the first of several decisions that would earn him the Medal of Honor and establish his place in Marine Corps legend. Leaving his damaged position, he crawled through enemy fire to a supply point 100 yards behind the lines, where reserve ammunition and spare weapons were stored. The journey took him across open ground that was being swept by Japanese machine gun fire, forcing him to move in short rushes between whatever cover he could find. When he reached the supply point, he discovered that it had been hit by artillery and most of the equipment had been destroyed or scattered. But among the wreckage, he found a second machine gun and several cases of ammunition. Without stopping to think about the risks, he began the dangerous journey back to his position. Carrying the heavy weapon and as much ammunition as he could manage, the return trip was even more hazardous than the approach. Japanese infiltrators had moved closer to the Marine lines, and several enemy soldiers spotted John as he struggled through the mud carrying the machine gun. Bullets whined around him as he dove for cover, dragging the weapon behind him and wondering if he would live long enough to put it into action. But when he finally reached his fighting position, John discovered that the situation had deteriorated even further. His original machine gun had been destroyed by a direct hit from a Japanese mortar, and the Marines in his sector were now depending entirely on rifle fire to stop the continuing enemy attacks. Without the sustained, high-volume fire that only a machine gun could provide, the defensive position was on the verge of being overrun. John immediately set up the second machine gun and resumed firing. When he ran out of ammunition for the weapon, he made 3 separate trips across ground swept by Japanese fire to retrieve more belts of .30 caliber rounds from supply points behind the lines, and when Japanese soldiers finally overran his position in a desperate charge, Basilone fought them off with his .45 caliber pistol and grenades, killing several enemy soldiers at point-blank range before falling back to a prepared secondary position and continuing to fire for 15 straight hours, from 11 p.m. on October 24 until 2 p.m. on October 25. John Basilone held his section of the Henderson Field perimeter against continuous attack by an entire Japanese regiment. When the battle finally ended, military intelligence officers counted over 200 Japanese soldiers killed directly in front of Basilone's position. His machine gun fire had broken the back of the Japanese attack and prevented the enemy from achieving their objective of recapturing Henderson Field, but more importantly, his leadership and example had inspired every Marine in his sector to fight beyond their limits. But victory on Guadalcanal would bring John Basilone a burden he had never expected. Washington, D.C., May 21, 1943. 6 months after the battle that made him famous, Platoon Sergeant John Basilone stood in the East Room of the White House, wearing his dress blue Marine uniform and trying not to fidget as President Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared to place the Medal of Honor around his neck. For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces, above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division. As the president read the citation, Basilone found himself thinking about the Marines who hadn't made it home from Guadalcanal. Men like Corporal Antonelli, who had been killed by a Japanese sniper 2 days after the October battle. Private Powell, who had died of malaria in a field hospital. Sergeant Martinez, who had been wounded so badly that he would never walk again. They were the real heroes, he thought. They had paid the ultimate price. All he had done was survive. It is with great honor, President Roosevelt continued, that I award the Medal of Honor to Platoon Sergeant John Basilone, United States Marine Corps. The crowd in the East Room erupted in applause. Photographers' flashbulbs popped like artillery flares. Reporters scribbled notes for stories that would make John Basilone a household name across America, but as the medal was placed around his neck, Basilone felt something unexpected. Guilt. While he was being celebrated as a hero, Marines were still fighting and dying in the Pacific. The war was far from over, and he was safe in Washington being treated like a celebrity. After the ceremony, as he shook hands with politicians and posed for more photographs, Basilone made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. He was going to ask to return to combat, but first, he would discover that being a hero in wartime America came with responsibilities he had never imagined. New York City, June 1943. The War Bond Tour was unlike anything John Basilone had ever experienced. Crowds of thousands gathered to see the Medal of Honor winner. Women threw themselves at him, and every speech he gave was front-page news in newspapers across the country. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed across Madison Square Garden, I present to you America's greatest hero, the man who single-handedly stopped an entire Japanese regiment on Guadalcanal, Medal of Honor winner John Basilone. The crowd of 15,000 people rose to their feet, cheering and applauding as Basilone walked to the podium. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt more alone than he had ever felt in combat. These people saw him as something he wasn't, a superhuman warrior who was immune to fear and doubt. They wanted him to be a symbol, not a person. Over the next 6 months, he traveled to dozens of cities, spoke at hundreds of events, and raised millions of dollars in war bonds. He was photographed with movie stars, politicians, and business leaders. He was offered lucrative endorsement deals and acting contracts, and every night, he went to bed feeling like a fraud. The real war was being fought thousands of miles away, on islands with names he had never heard of, by Marines who were facing the same desperate battles he had experienced on Guadalcanal. While he was giving speeches in air-conditioned auditoriums, they were dying in tropical jungles. It was during a war bond rally in Philadelphia that John Basilone met the person who would change his perspective on heroism, duty, and love. Her name was Lena May Ridgey, and she would give John Basilone something worth fighting for. Philadelphia, September 1943. Lena May Ridgey was not impressed by celebrities, war heroes, or men who thought that fame made them irresistible to women. At 32, she was an independent, intelligent woman who worked as a machinist in a defense plant and had no patience for men who couldn't see past their own egos. So when she was introduced to John Basilone at a war bond rally in Philadelphia, her first reaction was skepticism. "So you're the famous Medal of Honor winner," she said, shaking his hand with a firm grip that surprised him. "Tell me, what are you doing to help win this war besides making speeches?" The question caught Basilone off guard. Most people either treated him with worshipful reverence or tried to use his fame for their own purposes. Lena Ridgey seemed completely uninterested in his celebrity status. "I'm doing what the Marine Corps has asked me to do," he replied. "Raising money and morale for the war effort." "And how does that feel?" she asked. "Knowing that Marines your age are fighting and dying while you're safe at home giving speeches to people who will never see combat." It was a brutal question, but it was exactly what John Basilone had been thinking every day for the past 6 months. "It feels like hell," he admitted. "Every day I wake up knowing that I should be with my Marines, not standing on stages talking about battles that are already over." Lena studied his face, seeing something in his eyes that impressed her. "At least you're honest about it. Most of the heroes I've met seem to enjoy being heroes more than they enjoyed being soldiers." That conversation was the beginning of a relationship that would give John Basilone the first real happiness he had experienced since before the war. Lena saw through his fame and celebrity to the men underneath, someone who was struggling to understand his place in a war that had made him famous for all the wrong reasons. Over the next few months, as the war bond tour continued, John and Lena wrote letters to each other every day. She told him about her work in the defense plant, about the women she worked with who had husbands and brothers and sons fighting overseas. He told her about his growing frustration with celebrity and his desire to return to the Marines who needed him. "I never wanted to be famous," he wrote in one letter. "I just wanted to be a good Marine. But somehow, surviving when other Marines died has turned me into something I never intended to be." Lena's response was characteristically direct: "Then stop being what other people want you to be and start being what you know you should be." It was advice that would change John Basilone's life forever, but their love story would be tested by a decision that could cost John Basilone everything. Raritan, New Jersey, February 14, 1944. The wedding of John Basilone and Lena May Ridgey was front-page news across the country. "America's greatest hero marries defense worker sweetheart," read the headline in the New York Times. But for John and Lena, the wedding was a brief moment of peace in a world consumed by war. As they exchanged vows in the small Catholic church where John had been baptized, they both knew that their happiness was fragile and temporary. "Do you, John, take Lena to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," John said, looking into Lena's eyes and seeing the woman who had saved him from becoming a prisoner of his own fame. That night, alone with his new wife in their hotel room, John told Lena something that would break her heart and change both of their lives forever. "I've requested reassignment to a combat unit in the Pacific," he said quietly. Lena was silent for a long moment, processing what he had just told her. "When?" she asked. "I submitted the paperwork 2 weeks ago. Before the wedding. Why didn't you tell me?" Because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it. Lena got up from the bed and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the city. You're right. I would have. Because I love you, and I don't want to lose you. John joined her at the window, putting his arms around her from behind. I love you too. More than I've ever loved anyone or anything. But I have an obligation to the Marines who are still fighting. I can't live with myself knowing that I'm safe while they're in danger. Even if it means leaving me. Even if it means leaving you. Lena turned in his arms, looking up at the men she had just married. Then I'll wait for you. However long it takes, wherever this war takes you, I'll be here when you come home. It was a promise that would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. Within 6 months, John Basilone would be dead, and Lena would spend the rest of her life wondering if love was worth the price they had paid. Camp Pendleton, California, March 1944. The 5th Marine Division was preparing for something big. Even the newest recruits could sense it in the intensity of training, the constant flow of new equipment, and the grim expressions on the faces of senior officers who attended classified briefings. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, he had been promoted again, was now responsible for training machine gun crews and teaching young Marines the skills they would need to survive in combat. Listen up, Marines, he addressed a group of 18-year-old recruits who had volunteered for machine gun training. Everything I'm going to teach you has been tested in combat. Everything I'm going to show you has saved Marines' lives in real battles against real enemies. Private Danny Thomas, fresh from boot camp in Paris Island, raised his hand. Gunnery Sergeant, is it true that you killed over 200 Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal? Basilone studied the young Marine's earnest face. Private, the exact number doesn't matter. What matters is that I kept my machine gun firing when my Marines needed it most. That's what we're here to learn, how to be reliable when reliability means the difference between life and death. As the training session continued, Basilone found himself thinking about these young Marines who looked to him for guidance. Most of them were barely out of high school, kids from small towns across America who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They had no idea what they were about to face. That night, alone in his quarters, John wrote a letter to Lena, my darling wife. I can't tell you where we're going or when we're leaving, but I can tell you that this will probably be the biggest operation of the war. The Marines I'm training are good kids, but they're so young. Some of them remind me of myself when I first enlisted, full of energy and completely ignorant about what war really means. I think about you every day, about the life we could have together if this war ever ends. But I also think about these Marines, and I know that everything I learned on Guadalcanal might help keep some of them alive. I love you more than words can express. If something happens to me, know that you made me happier than I ever deserved to be. Your husband, John. He never sent the letter. 3 days later, the 5th Marine Division received orders to embark for the Pacific Theater. Their destination was classified, but rumors spread quickly through the camp. They were going to invade Japan itself, but first, they would have to capture an island that would become synonymous with hell. USS Missoula, February 15, 1945. The transport ship cut through the dark Pacific waters, carrying 3,000 Marines toward an island that none of them had heard of. 6 months earlier, Iwo Jima. John Basilone lay in his narrow bunk, looking at a photograph of Lena that he kept in his wallet. She was smiling, radiant with the joy of their wedding day, completely unaware that this picture might be the last image of her that he would ever see. Around him, young Marines whispered in the darkness, their voices revealing a mixture of fear, excitement, and uncertainty. Gunny Basilone. Private Thomas's voice came from the bunk above. Can I ask you something? What is it, son? Do you think we're all going to die on this island? It was the question that every Marine was thinking but afraid to ask. Basilone considered his answer carefully. Some of us won't make it home, he said quietly. That's the reality of war, and there's no point in lying about it. But every Marine in this compartment has been trained to do his job. You stick to your training, you take care of the Marines around you, and you give yourself the best chance of surviving. The next morning, the Marines received their final briefing about the operation. Intelligence officers spread maps of Iwo Jima across tables in the ship's briefing room, showing an island that looked deceptively small and harmless. "Gentlemen," Colonel Harry Liversedge's voice carried across the packed room. "Tomorrow morning, we will conduct an amphibious assault on the island of Iwo Jima. Do not let the size of this island fool you. Intelligence estimates indicate that General Kuribayashi has prepared the most elaborate defensive system in the history of warfare." After the briefing, as Marines filed out to make their final preparations, Basilone found himself at the rail of the transport ship, looking across dark water toward an island he couldn't yet see. Staff Sergeant Mike Strank joined him, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. "What do you think, John?" Strank asked. "Are we going to make it through this one?" Basilone was quiet for a long moment. "Mike, I've been thinking about something. On Guadalcanal, I fought to survive. This time, I'm fighting for those Marines in there." He gestured toward the compartments full of young soldiers. "If I can keep some of them alive, then whatever happens to me doesn't matter." "You sound like you're not planning to come home." "I'm planning to do my job," Basilone replied. "Everything else is up to God." At dawn, John Basilone would face the choice that would define his legacy forever. February 19, 1945, D-Day, Iwo Jima. The landing craft pitched and rolled in heavy seas as it approached the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. Inside, 30 Marines crouched shoulder to shoulder, their equipment secured, their faces set in the grim expressions of men who knew they were about to face hell. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone checked his watch. 0855 hours. 5 minutes until they hit the beach. Through the steel sides of the landing craft, he could hear the thunder of naval bombardment that had been pounding Iwo Jima for 3 days. But what worried Basilone was the silence from the defenders. "Lock and load." Basilone shouted over the roar of engines and exploding shells. The craft ground to a halt in the surf, and the ramp dropped with a crash. "Move. Move. Move." Basilone led his Marines into the water and up onto the strange black sand of Iwo Jima. The first thing that struck him was how difficult it was to move. The volcanic sand was soft and unstable, like trying to run through loose flour. Marines around him struggled under the weight of their equipment, some falling face first and having to be helped up by their comrades, but it was still eerily quiet. No machine gun fire, no mortars, no artillery. "This doesn't feel right," muttered Corporal Chuck Tatum, struggling with his machine gun tripod. "Keep moving," Basilone ordered. "Get off the beach." They had made it perhaps 200 yards inland when the silence was shattered by the most devastating barrage any of them had ever experienced. The Japanese had waited until the beaches were crowded with Marines and equipment before revealing their positions. From concealed bunkers and cave entrances carved into the volcanic rock, they poured devastating fire down onto the exposed Americans. Basilone threw himself into a shell crater, pulling 2 young Marines down with him as bullets whined overhead. "Stay down," he shouted over the incredible noise around them. The beach had become a vision of hell. Marines were scattered in whatever cover they could find. Equipment was destroyed or abandoned. The carefully planned assault was dissolving into chaos. "Gunny." Corporal Tatum crawled over, dragging his machine gun. "I can see muzzle flashes from that ridge. If we can get the gun set up, we can suppress some of that fire." Basilone studied the terrain through the smoke and dust. The Japanese positions were perfectly concealed, but he could identify the pattern of their fire. "See that bunker complex about 300 yards ahead," he pointed. "There's a machine gun nest that's got the whole center of the beach covered. We need to take it out." "How?" "We'll never get close enough." That's when John Basilone made the decision that would end his life and save dozens of Marines. "I'm going to take it out," he said, checking his demolition charges. "You provide covering fire." "Gunny, that's suicide." Basilone looked at the young Marine, seeing his own fear reflected back at him. "Chuck, those Marines down there are depending on us. If we don't eliminate that position, they're all going to die." Without waiting for a response, John Basilone began the most dangerous assault of his life. Using whatever cover he could find, rocks, abandoned equipment, shell craters, he began working his way toward the Japanese strongpoint that was decimating the Marines on the beach. It took him 40 minutes to cover 300 yards, crawling through volcanic sand while Japanese bullets whined overhead and mortar shells exploded around him. Twice he was almost hit by his own covering fire. 3 times he had to lie motionless while Japanese patrols passed within feet of his position, but he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that every minute he delayed meant more Marines would die on that beach. When he was finally close enough to see into the Japanese bunker, Basilone could hear the enemy soldiers talking, could smell their cigarettes, could see the muzzle flashes of their machine gun as it swept the beach below. He pulled the pin on his first demolition charge, counted to 3, and threw it through the firing port of the bunker. The explosion was muffled by the concrete walls, but he could hear screaming from inside. Before the defenders could recover, Basilone charged the entrance of the position, firing his .45 caliber pistol at any Japanese soldier who appeared. In 30 seconds of close-quarters combat, he killed 4 enemy soldiers and destroyed the machine gun that had been holding up the entire center of the Marine advance. But as he turned to signal his success to the Marines below, a Japanese sniper hidden in the rocks above put a single bullet through his chest. In his final moments, John Basilone would understand the true meaning of heroism. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone fell onto the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima at exactly 1,047 hours on February 19, 1945. Corporal Tatum was the first to reach him, sprinting across open ground despite the continuing enemy fire. "Gunny, can you hear me?" Basilone's eyes focused on the young Marine's face. Blood was frothing at the corners of his mouth, and Tatum could see that the wound was fatal. "Don't try to talk, Gunny. Corpsman's on the way." But Basilone reached up with his left hand and grabbed Tatum's uniform, pulling him closer. "The Marines," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Take care of the Marines." "We will, Gunny. We will." Basilone's hand loosened and fell to his side. At 1,049 hours on February 19, 1945, less than 2 hours after landing on Iwo Jima, John Basilone was dead, but his sacrifice had saved the lives of dozens of Marines who were now able to advance off the beach. The machine gun position he had destroyed had been the key to the Japanese defense of that sector. As word spread that John Basilone had been killed, something remarkable happened among the Marines of the 5th Division. Instead of being demoralized by the loss of their most famous member, they were inspired by his example. "Basilone showed us how it's done," Staff Sergeant Strank told his squad as they prepared to assault the next line of Japanese positions. "Now let's finish what he started." For the next 35 days, as the battle for Iwo Jima raged across the volcanic island, Marines would invoke Basilone's name when they needed courage. His death had given them a standard to live up to. Raritan, New Jersey, March 7, 1945. Lena Basilone was hanging laundry in her backyard when she saw the Western Union boy walking up her front steps. She knew immediately what the message would contain. With trembling hands, she opened the yellow telegram. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your husband, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone USMCR, was killed in action on February 19, 1945 on Iwo Jima." Lena sank into a chair on her front porch and wept for the men who had chosen duty over safety, brotherhood over comfort, and honor over his own life. Arlington National Cemetery, September 12, 1948. 3.5 years after his death on Iwo Jima, John Basilone was finally laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. His funeral was attended by hundreds of Marines, government officials, and ordinary Americans who had been inspired by his story. As the honor guard fired their final salute and a bugler played taps, Lena Basilone finally understood what her husband had been trying to tell her about duty, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect Marines to each other and to something larger than themselves. The legacy lives on today. More than 75 years after his death on Iwo Jima, John Basilone is remembered not just for what he accomplished, but for what he represented. the idea that ordinary people can rise to extraordinary heights when the situation demands it, and that true heroism often requires the most difficult choice of all, choosing duty over safety, service over self-preservation. His story has been told and retold in books, movies, documentaries, and television series. The HBO miniseries, The Pacific, introduced his story to a new generation of Americans. Schools, military installations, and public buildings bear his name. The USS Basilone carried his memory across the same Pacific waters where he fought and died, but perhaps the most fitting memorial to John Basilone is not carved in stone or cast in bronze. It exists in the living example of the Marines who continue to serve today, carrying forward the traditions of honor, courage, and commitment that he embodied. Every Marine who chooses to serve others before serving himself, every service member who volunteers for dangerous duty because that's where he's needed most, they are all part of John Basilone's continuing legacy. His hometown of Raritan holds an annual parade in his honor, drawing thousands of visitors who come to remember a local boy who became a national hero. Veterans march together down the same streets where John Basilone once walked as a troubled young man with no clear direction in life. The Marine Corps has institutionalized his memory in ways both formal and informal. Every Marine learns his story during boot camp, understanding that the traditions they inherit were paid for with the blood of Marines like John Basilone. The Medal of Honor that he earned on Guadalcanal is displayed at the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, Virginia. Beyond the formal recognition, John Basilone's story continues to resonate because it addresses fundamental questions about courage, duty, and the meaning of heroism that each generation must answer for itself. In an age when true sacrifice often seems rare and genuine heroism is sometimes difficult to distinguish from celebrity, his example provides a clear standard for measuring what really matters. The transformation from troubled youth to American legend wasn't easy or automatic. It required years of discipline, training, and the gradual recognition that individual fulfillment comes not from pursuing selfish goals but from serving something larger than oneself. His love story with Lena May Ritchie adds a human dimension to his heroic narrative, reminding us that even the most dedicated warriors need love, understanding, and the hope of a future beyond war. Their brief marriage represents all the dreams and possibilities that war destroys along with human lives. Lena never remarried, spending the rest of her life honoring the memory of a husband she had known for less than 2 years. The questions that John Basilone faced, about duty versus safety, service versus self-preservation, the responsibility that comes with surviving when others die, are questions that every generation of Americans must answer in their own way. His choices provide guidance for people facing their own moments of moral and ethical decision. Perhaps most importantly, his story demonstrates that heroism is not a single moment of dramatic action but a pattern of choices made over time. Each decision reflected a character that was gradually developing into something remarkable. The ultimate tragedy and triumph of John Basilone's life is that he achieved everything he set out to accomplish. He became an excellent Marine, he served with distinction in combat, he saved the lives of fellow Marines, and he died fighting alongside the men he had trained and led. The fame that followed was never his primary goal, it was simply the inevitable result of a life lived according to principles that placed service above self. His story is America's story, the story of a nation that has always found its heroes among ordinary people who rise to meet extraordinary challenges. From the farmers who fought at Lexington and Concord to the firefighters who ran into the burning towers on September 11th, America's heroes have typically been regular people who did what needed to be done when it needed to be done. John Basilone's legacy reminds us that such people still exist, that the capacity for heroism remains latent in the American character, waiting to be awakened by circumstances that demand the best from those who are willing to give it. The black sand of Iwo Jima claimed many heroes during those terrible 36 days of fighting in early 1945, but it claimed none whose story better illustrates the American capacity for redemption, transformation, and ultimate sacrifice in service of ideals that transcend individual life. John Basilone went to that island not seeking glory or recognition, but fulfilling a promise made to Marines who had died on Guadalcanal, a promise that he would never let Marines fight alone as long as he was alive to stand with them. He kept that promise, and in doing so, he achieved the only kind of immortality that really matters, the immortality that comes from inspiring others to be better than they thought they could be, to to do more than they thought they could do, and to sacrifice more than they thought they could sacrifice in service of something greater than themselves. The boy from Raritan who once seemed destined for nothing more than trouble and wasted potential became eternal proof that heroes can come from anywhere, that courage can be learned, and that the greatest victory any person can achieve is inspiring others to reach for their own greatness. John Basilone kept faith with his Marines, with his country, and with the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. His story is our story, the story of a nation that finds its strength not in perfection but in the continuous struggle to live up to its own highest ideals. It's a reminder that in our darkest hours, when everything seems lost and hope seems impossible, heroes can emerge from the most unlikely places to show us what courage really looks like and what it really costs. John Basilone showed us both. And in doing so, he became not just a Marine, not just a hero, but a permanent part of the American soul, a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're willing to pay the price that greatness demands.